Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 241, Social Psychology. Today we're going to go over Chapter 8, which is Persuasion. A couple quick announcements for you. As a reminder, as always, feel free to stop by office hours. If you have any questions, those are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30. I actually only have Tuesdays on here, but Thursdays as well. Remember, those are drop-in, drop-out, so you are welcome to stop by. As long as I'm not with a student, I'm going to let you in the office hours, not just in the waiting room, and we can chat. Other than that, as I'm about to send out an email, you should have received an email by the time this video goes up. The paper will be due not this coming, but the following week, given that I want to make sure people feel comfortable with it. Other than that, right, everything is still on track. Remember to start thinking about the final project on Blackboard, which will be due at the end of this semester. So let's talk about where we're going. So today, given that we're talking about this very interesting topic of persuasion, and then I have to give an online lecture, a lot of the content that I'm going to use to demonstrate what we're talking about is videos. So because I don't want to get copyright striked, we're going to save those for class time. So do keep in mind, if you have questions about this, please let me know in either at the beginning of class, looking at, well, I guess the quiz is due after, so probably at the beginning of class is the best thing to do. But let's talk about what we're doing today. We'll go over the basics of persuasion, and then we're going to talk about two models of persuasion. The first being the elaboration likelihood model, the ELM model of persuasion, or the ELM of persuasion, and then the Yale attitude change approach, which goes after the elements of persuasion, and we'll talk about three elements: the who, the what, and the whom. We'll talk a little bit about metacognition, which will go back into some of the stuff we mentioned over the past few weeks, things like embodied cognition. And then we'll talk about how we resist persuasion, and hopefully we'll have a nice discussion about this in class, but this should give us an idea. So let's talk about persuasion basics here. So the question is, how do we change attitudes? Well, we know, given our last lecture on attitudes, there's this problem of cognitive dissonance, right? Changes in attitude, right, isn't that difficult as long as there isn't an external justification for the behavior. So, for instance, there was no external justification to, right, support Fidel Castro in our Castro essay we talked about, so it's not hard to say, okay, so I have to write this essay pro-Castro, even though I'm anti-Castro. But then when we had insufficient justification as to why we had fun turning the pegs, given the Festinger task, that is going to be an example of cognitive dissonance and cause cognitive dissonance. So we know these work on the small scale, right? We know that, right, we can change attitudes on a small scale, but does this work for large scale attitude change? Well, no, not really. We can't really do cognitive dissonance on this huge, right, world-changing scale. But what we can do is we can use persuasive communication, right? Communication that's going to advocate for a particular side of an issue. Much more kind of standard when we think about this. This is things like debates or expressing your side. This isn't this kind of trick about making people have two inconsistent thoughts. But we need to talk about what makes persuasion effective. And to do so, we'll talk about these two different models, the Yale attitude change and the elaboration likelihood. But my question for you guys is, do you think that who says something impacts how you perceive it? So do you think that if I said something versus someone else telling you information, do you think that will change your belief about that information? Or in, for instance, if I show you something that's been made, can I change, right, the impact or the attitude you have towards it? So answer that question. Then I've got two more questions for you in the next slides. So on the next question, right, on a scale from 1 to 5, from 1 being strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree, how much do you agree with this following statement? I hold that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and is necessary in the political world as storms are in the physical. So tell me how much you agree or disagree with that, and then unpause the video. Okay, so this is just, right, a little thing I found online that I think is a really, right, probably for many of you, a quote that, right, you can believe, right, that not everything's going to go well. But what if I told you that this was by Osama bin Laden? Now, does that change your feelings about that quote, right? Do you all of a sudden maybe disagree with it a little more? given that nuance to it. Not only that, what if it was from, right, like Thomas Jefferson, who the quote was originally from? Would that maybe make you increase your agreement on it? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Now, how about this? On a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being, right, not pleasing at all, to 5 being very pleasing, how aesthetically pleasing do you find this painting? And if you find it pleasant, I hope you know that you like paintings by Adolf Hitler, which is, right, something that often makes us feel less like we like this. I mean, the painting is fine, but I think we attach a lot of feelings to that. And this is part of persuasion, part of cognitive dissonance, a lot of understanding how our world works. But one way that we can look at how our world works is through this elaboration likelihood model of persuasion. And that really comes down to the fact that there's a ton of factors to focus on, right? How do I know which ones I should? Well, we actually shift to focusing on how people will process the message in this model. Instead of looking at what people are paying attention to, we're going to look at how people cognitively process this information. And we know this is the elaboration likelihood model works on a dual process model of persuasion, very similar to our dual process models of thinking, where we talked about more of a heuristic style of thinking versus algorithmic style of thinking. And when we think about how persuasion works here, right, the idea is there is a stimulus that happens, right? We see an ad, or we get persuaded in some way. We're asked to consider some information. And we have two ways in which we can do this. We can do an impulsive, similar to a more heuristic route, or we can do a reflective, pausing and thinking about what we are reading, understanding, processing. And both of those will lead to the behavior, of either buying this, what have you, whatever our persuasive technique or whatever the thing is trying to persuade us about. And we know that this persuasive message, being this kind of stimuli, can lead to a central route of thinking or a peripheral route of thinking. Central being similar to our algorithms, and our peripheral being similar to, again, our heuristics. And these can lead to an attitude change, however. So let's talk about how. Well, with these two possible routes of persuasion, the idea is there is an effortless control. This is going to be our automatic processing, and these are our peripheral cues. And by peripheral, we're again talking kind of not central, so off to the sides. And these are not directly relevant to the argument, actually. And then we have a central processing route, Effortful processing, it takes effort to do. And we are focused on the central arguments, the quality of that argument. Is it a good argument or not? And so, for instance, look at a peripheral ad here. We might consider this more peripheral. What information does this give us about buying this car? Versus a more central route, I don't know how well you can see this, but this is listing all the details about this car, Focusing on, what is going to be more effective, focusing on what is going to be actually worth arguing, And so this peripheral route, we're going to use superficial cues, things like use maybe celebrities or music or pictures or pretty colors in all of our ads. Where our central route, we might use those cues, but we might encourage people to think carefully or logically or use rational arguments we hope people will listen to rather than distract them from other things. Some important factors for which one we will choose to use are our motivation and our ability. So how motivated are we to really care about this decision? Is this a boring decision, like what type of cereal are you going to pick up, which oftentimes is going to save you a couple cents but isn't going to change your world? Or is this going to be something like buying a new car where you're very motivated to find the best price, to find the best deal? And then ability. Are there other things, distractions, insufficient time, unable to think carefully about this? Maybe it's been a long day that might cause this. And so, all of this plays a role in how we are persuaded. So with motivation, some of the things that matter for motivation to know that we're motivated for these include personal relevance in this idea of need for cognition. So with personal relevance, as we've already mentioned, this is going to be something that is personally relevant, is something that we care about, So in the same way that personal relevance of information, helping us remember other people's birthdays when they're near our birthday, for instance, is going to matter more when we care about these things. So again, if I'm buying a new car, which I did a couple months ago, I was very motivated to make a good decision and to be persuaded by the correct things, right? To make the central processing route. This idea of need for cognition is really what it says. Need for cognition, right? Need for thinking. And what we see is that there is this individual difference where some people really like to think. Some people like to sit around and think. Some people like to do crosswords. They like to do puzzles. They like to engage their mind in some kind of activity of right, mental play, we might call it, right? Something to do. Giving your mind something to do. And other people, they're happy to just sit on the couch and kind of veg out and relax. And not necessarily are one of these better than the other. They're just two different styles, or maybe one set of, right, one trait on a continuum, you might say. Some people are high in this, some people are low in this, what have you. Now, we also have ability, right, where imagine you are at a carnival or a festival or a fair, right? You might be distracted. You might have insufficient time to think about the points that people are telling you about this product. You might have insufficient time to think carefully. You might be on a time limit, right? There might be, right, there will probably be for me, a kid pulling at me in a couple years saying, "Daddy, daddy, daddy," and that's going to not necessarily be easy for me to know what's going on at this point. So all of these matter. But first of all, it's important to note that motivation is going to often be the more relevant tool here. That the more motivated we are, the more likely we are to use this central route. The less motivated, the less likely we are to engage in that extra processing that we have to do to engage in the central route. So, which route should we use? Well, let's talk about motivations, process, and factors promoting attitude change. So with our motivations for this, right? If the issue is personally relevant, if we are knowledgeable in that domain, and if we are personally responsible for the outcome, right? So I was personally responsible for the car I was going to pick. If on the other hand, I wasn't responsible for it and I was coming along as a backup for somebody, right? It's not my car. I don't care about it that much. Well, with these, right, these types of motivations, we're going to use a central processing system, and we're going to focus on the quality of the argument, that central quality that's going to matter. Now, on the other hand, if the issue isn't personally relevant, right, it's something we don't care about, we're distracted or fatigued, we've had a long day, or if the message is hard to comprehend or is incomplete and there's just a lot going on, we're going to probably use the peripheral or heuristic kind of process here. And here, we might look at these source characteristics, right? So how attractive something is. Is the person famous who's telling us this? Do they have expertise in this? We can talk about length and number of arguments mattering and consensus. And a great example of this is this VLQ I have here. So make sure you answer this question. Right, there are a lot of arguments in favor of the Samsung phone in this ad, right over here. So the number of arguments is what? A central or peripheral cue. So go ahead and answer that question. Pause the video, and then we'll continue on. All right, so let's talk about a study looking at how we can be persuaded. So this is a really interesting study because it pulls upon what we just talked about in a really good way. So the first thing that we'll talk about with this is that this study was looking at college students and talking about mandatory comprehensive exams. So what you do is you have students come in and read about whether or not they should take these or whether the university should require mandatory comprehensive exams before you graduate. Now, you guys have a similar thing, I would argue. I would say that a senior project would be very similar to a comprehensive exam in the same way that I had to present a dissertation to get my PhD. So what they did is they looked at seniors, so college students read these arguments in favor of comprehensive exams, which we know most students are not in favor of right out the gate. And what they looked at was three different factors. The relevance, so they had I think they did it by juniors and seniors and freshmen and sophomores. And if you were a junior and senior, well, this program wouldn't go into effect until after you graduated. If you were a freshman and sophomore, this program would be required, or you'd be required to do these comprehensive exams before you graduate. So the relevance, are you an older student who this isn't going to affect, or are you a younger student who has a stake in the game? Then the quality of arguments. They differed on the they differed on the type of arguments they gave, right? Some of these quality arguments, the better arguments were, right, this looks good to employers, or it helps you gain skills in terms of how you look on paper, in terms of how our school is kind of perceived. And then you've got other, right, maybe less quality arguments. You go, right, it helps. So I just tried to look up this study, and they don't actually list what the weak arguments, but you could imagine them being like, other schools do mandatory exams, right? Or, like, we think it would be a good idea. Those aren't good arguments. Those are just what people think, right? They're more opinions. And then you had the number of arguments. So did you do 3 arguments or 6 arguments? So what you see here is these 3 factors. Does it matter to you? Are the arguments good or bad? And are there a lot of arguments versus a few arguments? Those are 3 factors that we can consider being important. Now, to kind of orient you to our graph here, I know it's a bit confusing, right? This is a 2 by 2 by 2 design, mixed ANOVA, if you're interested of knowing that. But so we've got our high relevance condition over here. So these are going to be the freshmen and sophomores. And then we have our low relevance over here, our juniors and seniors. We also have the number of arguments they've made, right? 3, or I guess it was 9, or this might have been a follow-up study. I only did look at the first study in that paper. So 3 versus 9. And then you ask them how much they agree on a scale from 0 to about 12. It was actually, you just put a line down in the middle. You say strongly disagree to strongly agree. Here's a line, mark where you think it is. And they actually measured it, which sounds like a lot of work. But so let's start with the high relevance people. So these people have a stake in the game. And so when looking at high relevant arguments with high quality arguments, what we see is that people actually change their minds. They're persuaded to say, you know what? That's a good example. Using 9 high quality arguments, right, is going to be very useful to, right, persuading somebody. If you came to me and said, here are 9 reasons why we shouldn't have a final, and they were all the best arguments I've ever seen, I mean, maybe I could be persuaded. You guys are not going to do that in this class to me, but maybe in another class, in another time, we could do that. Try again when it's not COVID is what I'll say. Now, on the other hand, let's talk about the low quality arguments. So these people have a stake in the game. They're not going to want to just look at the number of arguments. They care about the quality. They're going to use these central cues. And you see that. When you give me 9 crappy arguments, I'm going to look at you like, absolutely not. This is horrible. So this, right, could backfire if you guys were to try to present me 9 positive arguments. And I might just say, oh, absolutely not. Now, these are for people who are using the central processing route. These are the people who care. So let's talk about those who, right, the juniors and seniors who it doesn't matter. Well, in terms of the argument, right, we see that, well, again, high quality arguments are good to help us, right, more high quality arguments are good to help us increase, but we don't reach as high in terms of, right, our kind of understanding or belief about this. In fact, we reach just about the, maybe a little bit higher than the 3 arguments in the high relevance than the 9 arguments in the low relevance. Those are actually almost equal. But what about the low relevance condition? And here's what I think is really cool. We see the same pattern as those in the high argument quality condition for the low relevance. So to explain that in words, when a decision matters, when you can be persuaded and, right, something is on the line for you, you care about the level of detail in that argument. You want it to be a good argument, and the more good arguments they can make, the more likely you are to be persuaded. If I don't care about this, I mean, you just keep giving me more arguments, and I keep saying, well, that makes sense to me. And think about this like that study we talked about at the beginning of, or towards the beginning of the semester, where it's, hi, I've got to go make a few copies. Do you mind if I cut you? Right? The idea is that you don't really think about it. You just say, oh, well, it seems like the thing I need to do. And so recognizing that what this study is telling us here is that relevance is going to be a huge component, but it's not the only component. We know that the quality of arguments matters, specifically when it's relevant, and we know the number of arguments matter a lot. These peripheral cues do have a huge role on how we make decisions. But again, not every decision is super important, right? What pants do I put on today is not a huge decision that I need to, right, look at all of these details for. So that is the elaboration likelihood model, the idea being that there are at least two routes that we can do, and how we elaborate on our understanding of this matters. Now let's move on to the Yale attitude change approach. This is elements of persuasion, I believe your book calls it. I call it by its original name, the Yale attitude change approach. And the idea is it's who says what to whom. So who are the speaker effects? So what is your speaker, who is giving the message, and what is in that message, right? So we know the message is obviously going to matter, but what also matters is this whom, the audience to which you're giving the message, right? So now this makes intuitive sense to me. We're focusing on the three kind of sets of important information here. Why do you guys believe me, right, when I tell you this stuff, and why wouldn't you believe somebody maybe without my credentials? For instance, what is the message, which we know is going to matter, and we can talk about some of the things that affect that, and then the audience, right, as somebody giving information, right, knowing your audience is very important, and understanding how to kind of influence your audience best also matters, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which we can do that. But starting off with this who, or the speaker effects. So what is it that makes a speaker more, persuasive? Well, the first one is credibility. Does the person standing in front of you telling you, hey, buy this product, or, right, do this thing, are they a perceived expert in their field, right? So for instance, this article about, somebody using Lipitor, which is, right, a prescription drug, is being supported by this guy, Dr. Robert Yarvik, inventor of the artificial heart. And now Lipitor is reducing your, right, level of heart attack. So maybe you think, well, if this guy invented the, right, artificial heart, he's got to know something about hearts, so he probably is a good speaker here. So we might perceive he has some expertise. We don't know if he knows anything about drugs and their effects on the heart, but we know that he knows something about the heart, so he does seem kind of legit. This idea of trustworthiness as well. So one way that you can sound more trustworthy to people and be more trustworthy is arguing against your self-interest. So for instance, if you are debating me, and I, as we say, we kind of acknowledge a point on your side, right? Maybe, for instance, you guys are, again, say, trying to, let me pause and think of a good example. So if any of you have heard of the game Among Us, which has gotten into an extreme amount of popularity in the past couple weeks, the idea is that you're part of a crew, and there's a couple imposters among you who are trying to kill you. And one way you can increase your trustworthiness in this game, I found, is say, I know it's this guy, we should vote this guy off the island, but if it's not that guy, go ahead and vote me off next round, right? It's arguing against my self-interest, saying if it's not him, then go ahead and let me go. Or something like this is, it's definitely not that extreme most of these times, but the idea that, maybe I would say something like, I know you guys really don't want to do this paper, blah, 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 but like, I have to grade them too, and it takes me a long time, and I think it's really important for you to do that. That's arguing against my self-interest, because it's a lot easier for me to not have to grade things. Additionally, speaking quickly and without hesitation, something I am somewhat good at but not great at, also gives this impression that you are somebody who knows what they're talking about, knows what they're saying, understands what they're doing, and generally just comes off as a little more polished. And this is, again, a great peripheral cue to help us understand whether or not people are legit. Additionally, there's this idea of attractiveness. And attractiveness is a lot of things. First of all, it's this idea of physical appeal. Pretty people sell more things. If you've ever seen Comic-Cons or general kind of shows like that, oftentimes there are very attractive people standing by booths to kind of lure you in. This is also known as the halo effect, this idea that good-looking people are assumed to have other good qualities. There's the horn effect as well, which is the idea that people you don't like, or bad people, I don't necessarily think ugly people, but other people might be seen as like having worse qualities, right? If you think about the kind of people on TV who are the villains, they often have like scars or, mangled things. But generally, right, physical appeal is a good indicator of who we find to be more persuasive, the attractive person. We also have this idea of similarity. So who we find similar to us, right? This is why you see, right, in politics, you see a lot of ads from, I'm an everyman, and here's why I'm voting for whoever I am, right? Because they are supposedly more similar to you than that politician. These are going to be very useful in helping us to persuade people because they, right, are also these peripheral cues that we don't have, that we can kind of throw on in addition to some really valid arguments. Moving on from there, I do have one issue that some of you might recognize. Why do people believe tabloids, right? Why do people believe that Dr. Phil is a raging monster and Al Gore apparently caused a sex attack? I don't know what you would say there. Right? These are both untrue, but the idea behind it is we run into this information all the time, and I bet you can know where we run into this information a lot. And this is called a sleeper effect, and it is an issue with the speaker effects, if that could be more confusing. And the sleeper effect is this idea that we might delay the impact of a message when we just remember the message, but we forget why we didn't like it originally. So imagine you're scrolling through Facebook and you read that Bill Gates eats puppies for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and his 5G coronavirus vaccine is going to give us all, or turn us all into a lizard people. You might go, okay, yeah, that's complete baloney. That's not right. But you might see that that's posted on your crazy crackpot uncle or aunt's page on Facebook, and you go, okay, so I'm not going to believe that one bit because that looks like a conspiracy, and it is, believe it or not, unless I'm part of the deep state, in which case you got to make that decision. Over time, though, you're going to remember the message, but you'll forget where you heard it from. And maybe, in a less extreme example, you start to think, well, I definitely saw that on the news, or I definitely read it on a legitimate news site that isn't Facebook. And you might say, well, I definitely heard it from, I think it was so-and-so. And so we've now forgotten why we discounted that message. Now we have this message in our brain, but we forget why we said it was a bad message. We go, well, it must be a good message then. Now, of course, this is an extreme example, but this works a lot of times, right? Especially on kind of rumors and hearsay, right? Well, I heard so-and-so did this. So, well, I didn't know that. And most people don't fact check a lot of that. I mean, most people don't fact check much, but anyways. The who is going to be very important the who effects, I should say, are going to be very important to understanding, right, how best to present yourself to your audience. Or, right, if you are the head of a marketing team, who to use to give that information out. But we can also talk about, right, the message itself, the what effects. So what makes a message more persuasive? Well, quality and clarity are going to be important. Making sure you're not and ahhing your whole message, right? What's being said should make sense and be pretty quick. You don't want to elaborate and spend too much time on this, something I know I'm prone to do. You can also do what we call two-sided appeals. So acknowledging what the other side has said. You should only do this in a couple specific cases. Specifically, you should only use two-sided appeals. You should only say, well, what my opponent's saying, right? You should only do that when the audience is or will be aware of both sides. So at a debate, right? You know that you're going to hear the other side. That's going to make sense. But if I'm just standing up and telling you guys this, I don't want to let you know what the other side thinks. I want you to think just about my side. Just focus on my side, not their side. And also, you're going to want to use two-sided appeals if the audience disagrees with you. If the audience doesn't disagree with you, right? If you all agree with whatever I'm saying, why should I shoot myself in the foot and talk about the other side? I might say, well, the other side's stupid, but I don't want to explain anything. So this backfires if the audience is already on your side and they're not aware. They might or may not be aware of the other side. If somebody asks you about the other side, right, you probably quickly want to mention it, but say, well, they're wrong and we're right. Yay. And so recognizing that there are certain ways in which we can present ourselves as the speaker effects in the ways we present our information that influence how people take that. So what makes a message more persuasive? Well, we can talk about the primacy and recency effects. The primacy effect is the idea that the info given at the beginning, the prime or beginning information, right? Prime minister, the head minister, the number one minister, is going to be the most persuasive, the primacy information, versus the recency, the information given at the end, the most recent information. So say we have a debate and somebody gives a pro-war argument. And then after that, we say, okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Everybody go run to the bathroom, grab a drink, get what you need, and come back. Imagining this with old school debates on TV as well. And then we hear an anti-war argument after this. Okay, so that's one way we can run a, what would you call this, right? Run a debate. On the other hand, what we can do is we can do the pro-war argument. We can do the anti-war argument immediately after, and then we say, okay, let's take a break. Now, which of these is going to be more persuasive if you are, say, the pro-war person? Say you are the pro-war person. Which of these arguments do you want to give? Which of these two, versions do you want to give? You're going to want to give the second one because primacy is only going to work in a certain way. So, for instance, if you give the first argument here, you've given the argument, people have begun to think about it, but now there's the delay, and you've kind of given people some time to space out and stop thinking about your argument. And now the other person can come in and they're giving that last bit of information and they're able to kind of, wrap up and get that last word. And this is going to be the recency effect. Now, on the other hand, if there's no delay between these speakers, you go first and you are able to explain your full position. And here would be a great time to use two-sided appeals, right? And say, this is what my anti-war argument friend is going to say here, and this is why it's wrong. And now you've gone first, and the information in the middle, right, kind of if you think about this as a time, right, the information in the middle is going to kind of be forgotten a little bit over here, and you might remember some of it at the end, but you've had the chance to go first, and because it was all in one kind of block, you tend to see more of a primacy effect happen here, that people pay attention to that beginning information. Having this delay in the middle kind of resets you and maybe makes it harder for you to have that primacy effect. So recognizing that also, right, if you're in a debate, you might want to figure out which place you go in based on how the debate is set up. We also have this idea of information vividness. So the idea that more identifiable victims, for instance, or just more vivid messages are going to be more persuasive. Which of these two messages seems more persuasive? It's probably the one with Michael J. Fox, because he has been very much at the front showing off the effects of Parkinson's, understanding how, right, kind of making informing the population about what it is. And that is going to be much more effective than a fact-based message. And so remind me when I'm going over this to talk about my research idea given masks, because I want to hear what you guys think about it as well. So recognizing that's about the identifiable victim effect. But let's move on from that, just recognizing that information vividness works. But one thing we can do to make information very vivid is what is called fear appeals, right? So fear appeal is this idea of making people afraid. Because if you're afraid, you're likely going to try to get out of that state of fear. And if you watch those ads for, say, like a home security system, right? Those are supposed to make you uncomfortable because they want you to be afraid so they can sell a home security system. But they don't want to frighten you too much, right? Because there's only certain effective components of fear. One is that it's moderate fear. You can't do the most scary thing you've ever seen right? Because people are just afraid. They don't want to watch that. And then what you do is you couple it with what we call behavioral recommendations, or recommendations for what you can do to make this go away. So, oh my goodness, I just watched an ad, a kind of scary ad about somebody trying to break into their house, but ADT, I think is the name of one of the companies, protected them. And then they tell you, protect you and your family and your home by calling us today and setting up a security system. Right? So this is going to be helpful to keep you, or to get you out of that fear. Now, this isn't effective in domains that are already scary, right? Showing a scary, a scary ad about how terrifying something is to somebody who wants to go, to a haunted house, right? Or a scary ad about a haunted house is going to be less effective than a scary ad about your home becoming scary, right? Because this is going to lead to a just kind of matching. You already are, right? It's not doing anything. That fear isn't being used in an appropriate way. So all of these matter here in terms of our message. And so recognizing that, again, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, it's in what order you say it, it's in the ways in which you choose to demonstrate and present that information. And we'll have a lot of videos kind of going over these. So I've got another VLQ for you here. So go ahead and read this and give me your answer, please. And we will go over this in class. If you have any questions about this, obviously remember, I'm not grading you on I'm grading you on completion. I am not grading you on correctness. I just want you to give me what you think makes sense here. All right, so go ahead and pause the video, and then we will start up on the next slide. So now let's move on to the to whom, or the audience effects. So what makes an audience more persuaded? Well, one thing we can do is talk about their mood. Positive mood leads to greater persuasion. Just being in a good mood means you're more open to things, you're more likely to listen, you're more maybe likely to be persuaded. And we might misattribute a good mood to the message. And in one study by Janice and colleagues, what they did was they had people read and watch, I think it was read actually, some short articles and just rate to what percentage they'd been persuaded. But what they did was they differed whether they gave people food right beforehand or if they hadn't eaten in a few hours. And so what you see is, so I'm really interested in what 3D movies meant in terms of persuasion, but people seem to generally be okay with this. What you see here is that when you don't have food, most people aren't thinking we're going to get to the moon in 1965. Hilarious. But what you see, though, is that if you give people food beforehand, they're a lot happier. And typically, and that means they tend to be more persuaded. So one thing people do for their dissertations, fun fact, is it's kind of required, which is messed up, but what we do is we actually, as the graduate students, provide food to our faculty members. So I will bring, my wife and I went out the night before and bought a big thing of coffee that morning to buy the big thing of coffee. But we had a bunch of different stuff, different snacks, different fruits. They didn't eat it, but the idea is, if they do, maybe they're going to be a little happier and more likely to okay my dissertation. And that's just, it's a really weird, anyways, I'm going to skip from that. If you have questions, let me know. But some other things that make an audience more persuaded is this idea of distraction, right? If the message is weak, being distracted, we want you to be distracted, right? If the message is delivered by a credible person, right, it doesn't matter if you're distracted, you're going to be more persuaded because you're not thinking in that central route. Your mind is off somewhere else, right? So distracting people, if you don't have a good argument, is not a bad thing to do. But what else makes people more persuaded? Well, things like embodied cognition, we know, so getting people to head nod. Personality variables. Having high intelligence typically makes you more likely to use a central route. So we know, low intelligence individuals tend to be more persuaded, low need for cognition individuals, and then, age, typically the most impressionable being 18 to 25. So with all of this information, what I want you to be able to answer in this next VLQ is, if I wanted to persuade my audience using the Yale attitude change approach, Which of the following would be the most helpful? Should I give both sides of an argument during my lecture? Should I speak slowly with many pauses? Should I explain how I'm similar to my audience? Or should I use abstract rather than concrete examples? So go ahead and answer that, and I will go ahead and pause the video and meet you on the next slide. Okay, so the Yale attitude approach has a lot of different characteristics, which I've summed here. The who, the what, and the whom. With the who, we're talking about speaker effects, things like credibility and attractiveness of the speaker. With the what, we're talking about the message effects. We're talking about whether or not we should use two-sided appeals, how we can use primacy or recency to our advantage, how vivid the information is, and when and where we should use things like fear appeals. We also have the whom. We know that the audience is affected by things like mood, distraction, movement, personality variables. All of this is very interesting and kind of suggests, that persuasion is not simply about our argument, but about a lot of different characteristics. Now, let's talk about an application we're going to do in class, hopefully. So let's talk about how the Yale attitude approach deals with cults. That's something fun. Well, what makes a cult? Well, a cult is different than a religion because this is a distinctive ritual and beliefs related to its devotion to a god or person, usually far outside the mainstream. Oftentimes, it's beyond a religion because it isolates people from the surrounding evil culture. They often have a charismatic leader, and there are a lot of other factors that go into this. We can think about Charles Manson, Jim Jones of Jonestown, David Koresh of Waco, and then Marshall Applewhite, the head of the Heaven's Gate cult. Very interesting cult if you've never looked this up. What I want to do in a class is talk about how people using cult leaders can use the Yale attitude approach. So please make sure you are ready to discuss that during class this coming week. But with that, let's move on to metacognition, where metacognition is this idea that we have thoughts about thoughts, meta meaning of the same. So secondary thoughts that are reflections of our primary thoughts, the thoughts about our thoughts. So, you might have a thought like, oh, I'm hungry. And you might think, why am I so hungry? I thought I ate a while ago, Why does this make me feel this way? Well, one type of metacognitive thought is the self-validation thought or the self-validation hypothesis, The idea that feeling confident about our thoughts helps validate those thoughts. When we're not sure, we might notice some hesitation in our voice and hesitation in terms of thinking, yeah, I'm not really sure. But if we feel sure or we think we feel sure, we can be swayed in that direction. And this can be influenced by things like head nodding with embodied cognition. So recognizing that how we think about our thoughts, if you are put into a mindset where you are happy, where you believe that you are the confident person, that you are somebody who knows what they're talking about, if somebody's telling you that might be kind of a way that they're trying to sucker you into believing what they believe. And that is something to keep in mind as well. The last couple slides, let's talk about resisting persuasion, though. So we often focus on information that only, confirms our original attitudes. And this is this idea of selective attention. So we have selective attention towards what we agree with. We only focus on specific types of things. So if you are a huge sports buff and you are watching, you are getting excited for the baseball season at Stetson, and you have two news articles in front of you. One of them says Stetson shaping up to be, championship contenders this year. And you have another article that says it looks like Stetson's baseball team is going to struggle this year. Well, you're going to pay more attention to the article you agree with, assuming that you like Stetson. We only think critically when we need to. And this comes back to things like the cocktail party effect, where we have so much information coming in at once. We can only pay attention to so much of it, and we get it bottlenecked, as we call it. And so, we have all these inputs here, but we can only pay attention to a certain number of them, and so we try to pick what we should pay attention to. We only think critically when we need to, and most of the time, people don't choose to think critically. So we can selectively attend towards certain pieces of information, but say somebody shoves that article about how Stetson's not going to do so great on you. Well, you might selectively evaluate it as well. You might evaluate that information differently, given that it's against your beliefs. So what you might do is you might look, right? So one thing to note here, imagine that you read the article that's pro Stetson sports. You're going to read it. You're going to go, okay, cool. Good to know. It's good to know Stetson's going to do good this year. It looks like they're all happy. It looks like everything's going. And then you're not going to think critically. You're going to kind of skip over it, right? That's actually this idea of selective attention, right? You're only going to pay attention to that good article, and you're not going to focus too much on it. Now, when you evaluate that article, you're not going to care. But when you're faced with looking at that argument that says, hey, this isn't going to go so well for Stetson, you start nitpicking. Right? You start looking at how valuable that information is. If the information conforms our belief, we evaluate it normally. We don't spend too much time. But if it has information that we're not sure about, we start to look for flaws in credibility or how sound the source is. Well, who wrote this? Are they anti-Stetson? You didn't do that for the person who was giving you a pro-Stetson article. So why do you care so much about the anti-Stetson article? Because we don't want to be wrong. We want to be able to discount information if we don't think it agrees with us. We want to be able to maybe take a comforting lie over the uncomfortable truth, right? And so I think about this in terms of like climate change, where people don't like to acknowledge certain things because it doesn't fit with how they believe. And looking at the face of science might be difficult for some people who aren't very, especially if it's not a clear or understandable thing, right? Also reflects part of this argument as well. We can chat about that if you have any questions. Now, not only that, but this idea of this thought polarization hypothesis, which is going to come back up again when we talk about groups. The idea is that when we think about something, especially with other people, we tend to get more and more extreme over time. And we tend to entrench that attitude. We tend to follow it more and believe it more deeply. Generally, the longer we think about a position, the more we strongly endorse it. I think about letting this kind of marinade or stew in your mind. Right? So if I came to Stetson and I was like, yeah, it's fine. It seems nice. And then I started hanging out with people who are like, yeah, I really like Stetson. My thoughts about Stetson are probably going to get more positive and positive and positive as the groups will over time, and we will become more polarized and head towards an extreme position. Now, this does not mean that everybody ends up in an extreme position. It means that people move in a direction at the very extreme. And things like echo chambers online, people will move very quickly towards the polarized, very extreme positions, but most of the time that doesn't happen to us. But you can think about this kind of like a snowball effect, right? That as we start to understand or start to get an attitude towards something, we are going to be persuaded to believe that more and more and more and stronger as time goes on. And there's also this one issue of how we deal with misinformation or information that we're not sure about. I should say information we're not sure about. How about that? Not necessarily misinformation, right? That we can cause what is called attitude inoculation. So inoculation is more or less the idea of a vaccine. So you put in some dead kind of virus or bacteria or whatever it might be, and that is going to let your body kind of get used to it and fight it off and know how to fight this off in the future. So a small attack on a person's belief, which engage their pre-existing attitudes, their prior commitments, their background knowledge, all the things that they know about this. They, especially with a small argument, this enables them to counteract a larger attack and resist persuasion. What I mean by this is weak attacks on our beliefs mobilize our belief system further to dig in. So somebody saying Stetson sucks to you is a weak attack on your like of Stetson. But now if somebody comes and says, well, here's some major legit issues with Stetson, you've already been inoculated towards people being rude to Stetson, and you might dig yourself in and be like, no, Stetson's great. Right? So what happens is a small or weak argument against your position gives you more or less this booster shot to understand how to fight off any criticism in the future. Now, right, so say now I come to you with a strong argument against your position. Well, in the same way that your body might have already produced, right, it might be ready to fight off this infection, given that it's seen it before, you're ready to fight off this, change in attitude because of your position that you've already gotten and because of this small attack against your position earlier. And this is going to lead to the less likely change of your attitude, right? You're more able to fight off this attack against your attitude. So with that in mind, the last VLQ I want to talk about here is many individuals have claimed that social media sites are like Facebook and Twitter are echo chambers. Because individuals can just kind of put people in their subgroups and kick out anybody who doesn't believe them. How do we avoid this? What do? How do we promote healthy discussion online? Given what we've spoken about this chapter, I think this is a very difficult question and something we need to spend time on. As people interested in social psychology, we are very well equipped to know how to make arguments in a way that's unbalanced, or to present people with fair information, knowing these biases. How do we do it? So keep that in mind. Moving on from there, just a real quick thing, right? Peer pressure is real, and it does matter. I love this picture, right? That subjective norms, what people in your group think is the norm to do, influences the likelihood of behavior. If your 18-year-old friends think that smoking is the norm and you're part of that friend group, you're much more likely to cave to peer pressure to smoke, right? This is more influential with younger individuals and less as we get older. Now, I've put a nice summary slide here, kind of at the end. So just to remember that persuasive communications are more effective in broad attitude changes than cognitive dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance is good for these smaller attitudes, specific things. The elaboration likelihood model focuses on how we process information, not necessarily how we how or who is giving us this information. It's how we interpret the information, whereas the Yale attitude change focuses on the who, the what, the whom. Who's giving the message, the source, what is the message, and who is the audience, or whom being the audience. Our thoughts about our thoughts, or metacognitive thoughts, affect our attitudes and can actually make us think we know something better than we do. And there are just generally many variables that affect how we resist persuasion out there. And some of them are very useful. Some of them are harder to actually undo. With that, same announcements as we said at the beginning of the class. If you do have any questions, shoot me an email. Make sure you submit those VLQs before class, and the quiz will be up and ready to go for you after our class on whatever day you'll be there. So other than that, have a great day, and hope you enjoyed.